How do you accept the truth when it destroys everything you believed for half a century? I am 83 years old, and until a few months ago, I lived my entire life convinced that my sister died when we were young. That was the official story. That was the story my parents repeated. That was the story written in family records, whispered at funerals, and sealed by silence. But now I know it was a lie. My sister never died. She has been alive for more than 50 years, hiding in plain sight, and the weight of that truth is crushing me in ways I never imagined possible. I still remember the day she disappeared, or at least the version of that day that was allowed to exist. I was a teenager then, living in a world where questions were dangerous and obedience was survival. They told me there had been an accident. They told me it was better not to ask. And I believed them, because believing was easier than confronting the fear in my mother's eyes and the sudden rigidity in my father's voice. Back then, in the late 1950s, families protected secrets the same way governments did, with silence and threats disguised as love. For decades, I carried grief that never fully healed. Birthdays passed with an empty chair. Holidays came with forced smiles and forbidden names. And yet, something never felt right. There were moments, small and easy to dismiss, when reality cracked just enough to let doubt slip through. A document that didn't add up. A relative who changed the subject too quickly. A photograph that vanished from an album without explanation. Each time, I told myself I was imagining things, because the alternative was unbearable. What I didn't know was that while I was mourning a dead sister, she was building a new life under a different name. While I was aging, counting regrets, and accepting loss, she was choosing to stay hidden. And the most terrifying part is not that she survived, but that so many people knew and helped keep her secret. The truth was buried, deliberately, layer by layer, until time itself became part of the cover-up. Now, at the end of my life, I am left asking questions that no one wants to answer. Why was this hidden for so long? Who decided I didn't deserve the truth? And what kind of secret is so powerful that it can erase a person from their own family without leaving a trace? Because the closer I get to the truth, the more I realize this story is not just about survival, but about something far darker that still refuses to stay buried. Before this story goes any further, I need to pause for a moment, because what comes next only matters if you truly understand what you are hearing. Stories like this are not just about mystery or shock. They are about how easily truth can be rewritten, how silence can last longer than any lie, and how ordinary families can become part of something far bigger than they ever intended. If any part of this confession made you uncomfortable, confused, or emotionally shaken, that reaction matters more than you think. I want to know what you feel right now. Do you believe a family has the right to erase someone to protect a secret? Or do you think the truth should always come first, no matter the cost? Leave a comment below and tell me what stood out to you most so far, even if it is just one word like truth, fear, or betrayal. Your perspective helps keep these stories alive and forces questions that were never meant to be asked. If you are finding value in this kind of hidden history and final confession, take a second to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It tells me that these buried truths still matter, and it helps this story reach others who are drawn to secrets that were never supposed to surface. And if you are ready to continue, because what I discovered next changes everything I thought I knew about my sister's disappearance, let me know. The memory I have carried for most of my life begins with a closed coffin and too many adults telling me not to look. I was told my sister's body was damaged, that the accident had been violent, that seeing her would only deepen the trauma. At the time, I accepted that explanation because I was young and scared, and because everyone around me acted as if questioning it would somehow dishonor the dead. But now, looking back through the lens of what I know today, that day feels less like a funeral and more like a carefully staged performance. It was a small town, the kind where everyone knows everyone, especially in the late 1950s. News traveled fast, yet details about my sister's supposed death remained strangely vague. There was no police report shared with the family. No doctor ever spoke directly to me. The death certificate existed, but no one could explain who had actually identified the body. I remember noticing that my parents avoided each other's eyes during the service, as if they were afraid a single glance would expose something unspeakable. Years later, I learned that closed casket funerals were often used in cases involving shame, secrecy, or legal complications. At the time, I was told it was mercy. Now I understand it was control. That coffin did not protect me from pain. It protected a lie. A lie so heavy that it required an entire community to carry it without asking questions. Teachers, neighbors, even distant relatives played their part by never mentioning her name again. What haunts me most is the realization that someone was buried that day. But it was not my sister. It was the truth. Whatever happened forced my family into silence, and silence became the price of survival. In the decades that followed, I replayed that funeral in my mind countless times, never realizing that the discomfort I felt was my intuition screaming to be heard. The smell of flowers, the hushed voices, the way my mother's hands trembled not with grief but with fear. Now I see that day for what it truly was, the beginning of a cover-up that reshaped every life it touched, including mine. And as I started pulling at the loose threads decades later, I realized that the past was not buried nearly as deep as they hoped, and the signs had been there all along, waiting for me to finally see them. For most of my adult life, I believed grief was supposed to fade quietly into the background, turning into a dull ache you learn to live with. What I did not understand was that some emotions do not fade because they are not grief at all. They are warnings, and mine never stopped. They followed me through marriages, jobs, children, and the slow erosion of time, resurfacing in moments that made no sense until now. There were letters that arrived with no return address, always postmarked from different cities, always written in a careful hand that avoided anything personal. My mother burned them without explanation. When I asked, she said they were advertisements, junk mail, nothing important. I believed her because I wanted to believe her. There were phone calls late at night where no one spoke, just breathing on the other end before the line went dead. My father would answer, go pale, and hang up without a word. The next morning, everything returned to normal, as if silence could erase memory. As the years passed, I noticed patterns that only stand out when you stop making excuses for them. My parents refused to travel to certain states. Certain names were never spoken. Certain dates were avoided entirely. When my children asked about their aunt, the answers were rehearsed, emotionless, as if grief had been drained of all humanity and replaced with procedure. That should have disturbed me more than it did. The most unsettling sign came in the form of a photograph I remembered clearly from my childhood. It showed my sister standing near a lake, smiling at the camera, sunlight cutting across her face. One day, while visiting my parents' house in the early 1980s, I noticed the photograph was gone. The frame remained, but the image had been removed. When I asked about it, my mother said it never existed. That was the moment I felt something inside me fracture. Not break, but shift. What terrifies me now is realizing how willing I was to participate in my own deception. I ignored my instincts because facing the truth would have meant confronting something far larger than personal loss. It would have meant accepting that everything I was taught about loyalty, family, and protection had been built on omission. And once I finally allowed myself to see those signs for what they were, I understood that they were not random at all. They were breadcrumbs leading to a truth I was never meant to follow, a truth that would soon force me to ask a question I was not prepared to answer. The truth did not reveal itself all at once. It never does. It arrived slowly, disguised as routine paperwork and administrative errors, the kind most people would overlook without a second thought. It started when I was sorting through old family documents after my parents passed away, decades after the funeral that ended my sister's life on paper. Birth certificates, insurance forms, faded letters, all the artifacts of a life that pretended to be ordinary. Then I found something that should not have existed at all. There was a government-issued record dated nearly 10 years after my sister's supposed death. The name was not hers, but the birth date was identical. Same town, same hospital, same parents. At first, I assumed it was a clerical mistake. but mistakes do not repeat themselves across multiple files. As I kept digging, I found variations of the same identity appearing in different states, always just far enough apart to avoid detection, always legally clean. This was not an accident. It was a constructed life. What shook me most was realizing how many systems had quietly cooperated. Social services, medical records, employment histories, all aligned just enough to create plausibility. This was not the work of a frightened family acting alone. Someone had knowledge, someone had authority, and someone had decided that my sister needed to disappear completely, not just from our family, but from the version of history we were allowed to see. The deeper I went, the more resistance I encountered. Requests for information were delayed. Files were marked unavailable. A retired clerk told me, off the record, that certain records from the 1950s and 60s were quietly amended during periods of heightened political tension. Cold War years, domestic fear, government pressure. That was when it hit me that my family's secret might be connected to something much larger than shame or scandal. The final confirmation came from a registry photograph taken in the early 1970s. The image quality was poor, but the eyes were unmistakable. The same eyes I grew up with. The same expression she had as a child when she knew something others did not. In that moment, denial became impossible. My sister was alive. She had always been alive. And someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure I would never find her. I imagined the reunion for weeks before it happened, replaying it in my mind like a scene I had earned through suffering. I thought there would be tears, apologies, explanations that stitched 50 years of absence into something survivable. I believed that once I stood in front of her, once she saw how old I had become, the wall between us would collapse. I was wrong about all of it. Finding her address took months of careful confirmation. I did not knock on the door right away. I sat in my car across the street, watching a house that looked painfully ordinary, trying to reconcile it with the decades of silence that led me there. When she finally opened the door, there was no shock in her eyes, only recognition. That was the moment that broke me. She knew I would come eventually. She had been waiting, not with hope, but with dread. She did not invite me inside. She stepped out, closed the door behind her, and asked me not to say her name out loud. Her voice was calm, rehearsed, as if she had practiced this moment for years. I told her who I was, even though she already knew. I told her our parents were gone. I told her I had spent my entire life believing she was dead. She listened without interrupting, without visible emotion, and when I finished, she said something I was not prepared to hear. She told me she could not be found, not now, not ever. She said that surviving meant disappearing, and disappearing meant never looking back. When I asked why she left, she refused to answer. When I asked who helped her, she looked away. And when I asked why I was never told, her voice finally cracked. She said that telling me would have put me in danger too. In that moment, the reunion I dreamed of collapsed into something colder and far more terrifying. This was not a story about escape. It was about containment, about choices made under pressure that could never be undone. She asked me to leave and never return, not out of anger, but out of fear. And as I walked away, I realized the truth I uncovered had not brought relief. It had only opened the door to a secret so heavy that even now, she was still running from it. I did not hear the full truth that day. Not on the sidewalk. Not in her voice as she asked me to leave. But secrets like hers do not end with silence. They linger. And sometimes they crack under their own weight. A week after I returned home, a letter arrived. No return address, no signature. I recognized the handwriting immediately. It was hers. She wrote that there were things she could never say out loud, because words have a way of surviving longer than people. What she could admit, she wrote, was that her disappearance was not an act of rebellion or fear alone. It was a decision made under pressure, guided by people who promised protection and delivered erasure. She was young, frightened, and carrying knowledge that did not belong to her. Knowledge that powerful men did not want remembered. According to the letter, She witnessed something in the late 1950s that placed her in the wrong place at the worst possible time. She never named it directly, only described the aftermath. Men in suits. Questions asked without answers offered. A choice framed as mercy. Disappear quietly and live, or stay and become an example. Our parents were given instructions. Silence was non-negotiable. A funeral solved. Everything on paper. She told me she had lived under constant surveillance for years, moving when told, changing names, never forming attachments that could be traced back. Even now, decades later, she believed some promises never expire. She begged me not to share what I had learned, not because she feared punishment, but because she feared consequences for those who crossed paths with her truth, including me. Reading her words, I understood why she did not want to be found. This was not about hiding from the past. It was about surviving the present. And the most painful realization was that by searching for her, I may have broken a rule that was never meant to be questioned. Because once a secret like this is exposed, it does not stay contained, it spreads. And the guilt of that possibility now rests on my conscience. I did not plan to tell this story. For weeks after reading her letter, I tried to convince myself that silence was the final act of love. That honoring her request meant carrying the weight alone, letting the truth die with me the way it was always intended to. But silence has a way of turning inward. At my age, memories do not fade gently. They press harder, louder, demanding resolution even when none exists. I am 83 years old now. My body reminds me every morning that time is no longer something I control. And the closer I get to the end, the more impossible it becomes to justify protecting a lie that shaped every relationship I ever had. I lost my parents without ever knowing who they truly were. I lost my sister without ever being allowed to grieve her properly. And I lost decades of my life believing that absence meant death, not design. What haunts me most is not what she saw or who forced her to disappear. It is the realization that ordinary people like us can become collateral damage in stories that never make headlines. No history books record the lives quietly erased to preserve larger narratives. No monuments honor the families, trained to forget. We are expected to accept official versions of reality and move on, never asking who paid the price for that convenience. I am telling this now because secrets do not vanish when they are hidden. They rot. They distort memory, morality, and identity. I do not expect justice. I do not expect forgiveness. I only want the truth to exist somewhere outside my own mind before it is too late. Because if no one speaks, these stories repeat themselves, quietly, endlessly, in homes that look just like yours. If this confession stayed with you, leave a comment with the word confession or silence and tell me what part of this story felt the most real to you. If you made it all the way to the end of this confession, I want to thank you for staying with me through a story that was never meant to be told. Stories like this only exist because someone is willing to listen, to sit with discomfort, and to question the versions of truth we are handed without explanation. If this story made you think, disturbed you, or stayed in your mind longer than you expected, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. It helps keep these hidden confessions alive and ensures more stories like this are brought into the light. If you are still here, leave a like as well. It tells me that these buried truths matter, and I want you to comment something specific, so I know you truly stayed until the end. Write, "The truth always waits," in the comments. Those words matter more than you think. When you are ready, continue with the next story appearing on your screen. Some secrets are connected, and once you start listening, it becomes impossible to stop.